The solution is to use the character controller, but you want to have your character actually interact with Unity physics? In that case, you can simply make it so that for every contact your character controller makes with a rigid body, apply a force at the contact point in the direction of the surface normal. Hold on though, you might want more than just physics interaction. What if you want your character to be affected by physics too? So in this video, we'll go in depth on how you should be exactly making your player controller, what exactly you should be careful of, and which approach you should ultimately choose in the end. When creating a rigid body controller, you've probably seen tutorials where people directly set the velocity of the rigid body. I have to tell you, this is not entirely the right way of using rigid body and something you should pretty much avoid. Setting velocity every physics frame explicitly is not recommended in Unity's documentation. Here's why. First, let's understand what a rigid body actually is. A rigid body controls objects through a physics simulation, which means that it is trying to simulate how physics works in real life. Physics simulation in Unity runs a fixed rate, which is, by the way, why everyone tells you to put your physics code in fixed update to sync with the physics engine. And when we force and manually set velocity every physics frame on a rigid body, we're essentially breaking the laws of physics. What you should be doing instead is adding force to the rigid body. But this, of course, also has problems. Humans move like this, not like this.
Oh, hell no.
The truth is, the player controllers we develop for games don't perfectly represent real-life physics, which is exactly why making a proper rigid body player controller is so challenging. In real life, we don't have a floating capsule. So how do we do this the right way? First of all, we need to use the force mode of velocity change when adding force to the rigid body. This ensures that velocity changes aren't affected by the rigid body's mass or the simulation step length. Next, we need to fix the slipperiness problem. This can be solved by applying much higher drag while the player is on the ground. I want to emphasize, only when on the ground. Why, you might ask? If you were to, for example, walk off an edge, you'll notice your character will glide and float unnaturally. So you need a separate ground check system, which I'll explain next, to determine whether your character is in air or grounded. If a character is in the air, you'll want to set the drag much lower. How do you handle ground checking with rigid bodies? You might say just a simple raycast, but to this, I'd like to say this isn't going to give you accurate results. If your character is on an edge, it will falsely report that the player is in the air, which definitely isn't what we want. As alternatives, we could use a sphere cast, which shoots out a sphere instead of a single ray, or use on collision enter callback. However, with both approaches, you also need to verify that the collided surface is actually ground. What I mean by this is that if you hit a wall, it might register as ground too. So if you walk off while colliding with a wall, your character controller might hit an edge case and still think you're grounded. To fix this, you can either manually assign all real ground objects to a separate ground physics layer, or check the slope angle. The slope angle is the angle between the player's down vector and the ground surface's normal vector. If this angle doesn't exceed a certain threshold, then you register it as ground. As a different way to fix this problem, you could also theoretically make the sphere cast slightly smaller than the collider so it won't register walls, but this has caused other edge case problems for me. We're not done with the problems yet. We also have slope problems. Since we have a rigid body, which is a physics object, on a slope, it's natural that our physics object will slide down. To prevent this, we can add a counterforce upward that counteracts gravity when you're on a slope. Sure, now let's try moving on a slope. You'll notice your rigid body player controller moves slower when going uphill and faster going downhill. You need to ensure the force you're applying isn't based on the player's rotation, but is parallel to the ground surface. You can get this vector by taking the ground's normal and finding the perpendicular vector to that normal. And then when going downhill, you also need to ensure that the force you're applying matches the force when going uphill. What I mean by this is that you have to account for the gravitational force that's constantly applied to your character. Since our movement on a slope is perpendicular to the surface, we can simply add an upward force matching the gravitational force so that it would counteract gravity here as well. Alright, do we now have the perfect rigid body controller? Unfortunately, not quite. As soon as we start walking upstairs, you'll notice the next problem. it simply won't work. The issue is that humans have legs that can bend to climb stairs, but we're working with one solid physics object that needs to somehow get up or down those stairs. There are several ways to solve this. The easiest is replacing the stair collider with a slope collider instead. So while it visually looks like stairs, your player controller actually interacts with just a slope collider. You can then add additional camera bobbing effects to make the stair climbing feel more realistic. But sometimes you want real stairs with real colliders. It also makes the environment designer's job easier. There are also a couple solutions for this as well. Here's one I like to use. Teleport the player up to match the stair height if they collide with one. Since you're moving forward, the player controller has forward force applied constantly. So now if you just teleport the player up, it's like continuously walking forward, but your character will teleport up the stairs. For this, it's crucial that you use Rigidbody.move position to teleport your player, because this creates smooth transitions between update frames. You'll also need interpolation enabled in the Rigidbody settings, which you should have anyway if you're making a first-person controller. What about going down? Same principle. You want to teleport the player's position to the stair below, otherwise you will just glide through the stairs. Okay, now we have at least a functional player controller for most scenarios. I say most because you never know what physics problems you will encounter later. Which brings us to a different solution, not using the physics engine at all. Unity's character controller. Since the character controller doesn't use Unity's physics engine, we update it in the update method. Many people think that every moving code needs to go in fixed update, but that's not the case. The benefit of using the character controller is that most problems we had with rigid bodies simply don't exist. We don't even need to implement separate ground checking. There's one already built in to the character controller. Slopes works out of the box, no slipping, equal velocity in both directions. Stairs, also built in and adjustable with the step offset property. For interacting with physics objects in the scene, you can do what I mentioned in the intro, just apply forces manually for each rigid body collision. So the conclusion is that with all these features built in, unless you really need physics simulation, I definitely recommend sticking with character controller for most cases. That is, unless you're making a game where your player needs to be pushed back by wind or something. Even for things like ragdoll effects on death, you could take a hybrid approach where you enable rigid body and disable character controller when the player dies, and then obviously switch back when they respawn. That's about it. I don't usually make tutorials like these, but I've been getting requests and this complements my first-person camera tutorial. With that said, I don't plan to become a full Unity tutorial channel, at least for now though. This has been Semi-Coder. I kind of know how to code.